Hello, everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and this is Pepper, and today we are going to be continuing our reading of The Borrowers by Mary Norton. When last we had left the story, we had been introduced to a family of very small people, very proud people, who lived in a home within a home. Their names were Homily, Pod, and Arrietty, and, as their name suggests, they borrowed things. When last we left them, Pod was late for dinner. His wife Homily was getting worried, and his daughter Arrietty was writing in her journal. At the end of the last chapter, Pod returns, and that's where we'll pick up with chapter 4. Pod came in slowly, his sack on his back. He leaned his hat pin with its dangling name tape against the wall, and on the middle of the kitchen table he placed a doll's teacup. It seemed the size of a mixing bowl. "Why, Pod," began Homily. "Got the saucer too," he said. He swung down the sack and untied the neck. "Here you are," he said, drawing out the saucer. "Matches it." He had a round, currant bunny sort of face. Tonight, it looked flabby. "Oh, Pod," said Homily, "you do look queer. Are you all right?" Pod sat down. "I'm fair enough," he said. "Oh, you went up the curtain," said Homily. "Oh, Pod, you shouldn't have. It's shaken you." Pod made a strange face. His eyes swiveled round towards Arrietty. Homily stared at him, her mouth open, and then she turned. "Come along, Arrietty," she said briskly. "You pop off to bed now, like a good girl, and I'll bring you some supper." "Oh," said Arrietty, "can't I see the rest of the borrowings?" "Your father's got nothing now, only food. Off you pop to bed. You've seen the cup and saucer." Arrietty went into the sitting room to put away her diary, and took some time fixing her candle on the upturned drawing pin which served as a holder. "Whatever are you doing?" grumbled Homily. "Give it here. There, that's the way. Now off to bed and fold your clothes, mind." "Good night, Papa," said Arrietty, kissing his flat white cheek. "Careful of the light," he said mechanically, and watched her with his round eyes until she had closed the door. "Now, Pod," said Homily, when they were alone, "tell me, what's the matter?" Pod looked at her blankly. "I've been seen," he said. Homily put out a groping hand for the edge of the table. She grasped it and lowered herself slowly onto the stool. "Oh, Pod," she said. There was a silence between them. Pod stared at Homily, and Homily stared at the table. After a while she raised her white face. "Badly?" she said. Pod moved restlessly. "I don't know about badly. I've been seen. Isn't that bad enough?" "No one," said Homily slowly, "hasn't never been seen since Uncle Hendreary, and he was the first, they say, for 45 years. A thought struck her, and she gripped the table. "It's no good, Pod. I won't emigrate." "No one's asked you to," said Pod. "To go and live like Hendreary and Loopy in a badger's set? The other side of the world, that's where they say it is, all among the earthworms." "It's 2 fields away, above the spinney," said Pod. "Nuts, that's what they eat, and berries. I wouldn't wonder if they don't eat mice." "You've eaten mice yourself," Pod reminded her. "All draughts and fresh air and the children growing up wild. Think of Harrietty," said Homily. "Think of the way she's been brought up. An only child. She'd catch her death. It's different for Hendreary." "Why?" asked Pod. "He's got 5. "That's why," explained Homily. "When you've got 5, they're brought up rough. But never mind that now. Who saw you?" "A boy," said Pod. "Oh, what?" exclaimed Homily, staring. "A boy." Pod sketched out a rough shape in the air. "You know, a boy." "But there isn't. I mean, what sort of a boy?" "I don't know what you mean, what sort of a boy. A boy in a nightshirt. A boy. You know what a boy is, don't you?" "Yes," said Homily, "I know what a boy is. But there hasn't been a boy. Not in this house. These 20 years. "Well," said Pod, "there's one here now." Homily stared at him in silence, and Pod met her eyes. "Where did he see you?" asked Homily at last. "In the schoolroom." "Oh," said Homily, "when you was getting the cup?" "Yes," said Pod. "Haven't you got eyes?" asked Homily. "Can't you have looked first?" "There's never nobody in the schoolroom. And what's more," he went on, "there wasn't today." "Then where was he?" "In bed. In the night nursery, or whatever it's called. That's where he was, sitting up in bed, with the doors open." "Well, you could have looked in the nursery." "How could I, halfway up the curtain?" "Is that where you was?" "Yes." "With the cup?"
"Yes. I couldn't get up or down."
"Oh, Pod," wailed Homily. "I should never have let you go. Not at your age."
"Now, look here," said Pod. "Don't mistake me. I got up all right. Got up like a bird, as you might say, bubbles or no bubbles. But," he leaned towards her, "afterwards, with the cup in me hand, if you see what I mean. He picked it up off the table. You see, it's heavy like. You can hold it by the handle, like this, but it drops or droops, as you might say. You should take a cup like this in your two hands. A bit of cheese off a shelf or an apple. Well, I drop that, give it a push and it falls and I climbs down in my own time and picks it up. But with a cup, you see what I mean. And coming down, you got to watch your feet. And as I say, some of the bobbles was missing. You didn't know what you could hold on to, not safely. And here we have a couple of pictures. This one of Pod climbing up the bobbles on the curtain to reach the cabinet in which is contained the cup. "Oh, Pod," said Homily, her eyes full of tears. "What did you do?" "Well," said Pod, sitting back again, "he took the cup." "What do you mean?" exclaimed Homily, aghast. Pod avoided her eyes. "Well, he'd been sitting up in bed there, watching me. I'd been on that curtain a good 10 minutes, because the hall clock had just struck the quarter." "But how do you mean he took the cup?" "Well, he got out of bed, and there he was standing, looking up. 'I'll take the cup,' he said." "Oh," gasped Homily, her eyes staring. "And you give it to him?" "He took it," said Pod, ever so gentle, "and then, when I was down, he give it to me." And here we have those moments in time. Poor Pod looking so surprised as the boy reaches out his hand to take the cup. And then the conclusion of that moment, with Pod being given the cup again after making his way safely down the curtain. Homily put her face in her hands. "Now, don't take on," said Pod uneasily. "He might have caught you," shuddered Homily in a stifled voice. "Yes," said Pod, "but he just give me the cup. 'Here you are,' he said." Homily raised her face. "What are we going to do?" she asked. Pod sighed. "Well, there isn't nothing we can do, except—" "Oh no," exclaimed Homily. "Not that. Not emigrate. Not that, Pod, now that I've got the house so nice and a clock and all." "We could take the clock," said Pod. "And Harrietty? What about her? She's not like those cousins. She can read, Pod, and sew a treat." "He don't know where we live," said Pod. "Oh, but they look," exclaimed Homily. "Remember Hen Dreary? They got the cat and—" Now, said Pod, "don't bring up the past." "Oh, but you've got to think of it. They got the cat and—" "Yes," said Pod, "but Eggletina was different." "How different? She was Harrietty's age." "Well, they hadn't told her, you see. That's where they went wrong. They tried to make her believe that there wasn't nothing but what was under the floor. They never told her about Mrs. Dryber. or crampful, least of all about cats.
There wasn't any cat, Homily pointed out. Not till Hendreary was seen.
Well, there was then, said Pod. You got to tell them. That's what I say, or they try to find out for themselves.
Pod, said Homily, solemnly. We haven't told Ariete.
Oh, she knows, said Pod. He moved uncomfortably. She's got her grating.
She doesn't know about Eglantine. She doesn't know about being seen.
Well, said Pod, we'll tell her. We always said we would. There's no hurry.
Homily stood up. Pod, she said, we're going to tell her tonight. Chapter 5. Ariete had not been asleep. She had been lying under her knitted coverlet, staring up at the ceiling. It was an interesting ceiling. Pod had built Ariete's bedroom out of 2 cigar boxes, and on the ceiling lovely painted ladies, dressed in swirls of chiffon, blew long trumpets against a background of blue sky. Below, there were feathery palm trees and small white houses set about a square. It was a glamorous scene, above all by candlelight. But tonight, Ariete had stared without seeing. The wood of a cigar box is thin, and Ariete, lying straight and still under the quilt, heard the rise and fall of worried voices. She had heard her own name. She had heard Homily exclaim, "Nuts and berries, that's what they eat." And she had heard, after a while, the heartfelt cry of, "What shall we do?" So when Homily appeared beside her bed, she wrapped herself obediently in her quilt and, padding in her bare feet along the dusty passage, she joined her parents in the warmth of the kitchen. Crouched on her little stool, she sat, clasping her knees, shivering a little, and looking from one face to another. Homily came beside her, and, kneeling on the floor, she placed an arm round Ariete's skinny shoulders. "Ariete," she said gravely, "you know about upstairs." "What about it?" asked Ariete. "You know about the 2 giants." "Yes," said Ariete. "Great Aunt Sophie and Mrs. Driver." "That's right," said Homily, "and Crampfurl in the garden." She laid a roughened hand on Ariete's clasped ones. "You know about Uncle Hendreary?" Ariete thought a while. "He went abroad," she said. "Emigrated," corrected Homily, "to the other side of the world, with Aunt Loopy and all the children, to a badger's set." A hole in a bank under a hawthorn hedge. Now, why do you think he did this? Oh, said Ariete, her face alight, to be out of doors, to lie in the sun, to run in the grass, to swing on twigs like the birds do, to suck honey. Nonsense, Ariete, exclaimed Homily sharply. That's a nasty habit, and your Uncle Henry is a rheumatic sort of man. He emigrated, she went on, stressing the word, because he was seen. Oh, said Ariete. He was seen on 23rd of April, 1892, by Rosa Pickhatchet on the drawing-room mantelpiece, of all places, she added suddenly, in a wondering aside. Oh, said Ariete. I have never heard, nor no one has never seen fit to tell why he went on the drawing-room mantelpiece in the first place. There's nothing on it, your father assures me, which cannot be seen from the floor or by standing sideways on the handle of the bureau and steadying yourself on the key. That's what your father does if he ever goes into the drawing-room.
They said it was a liver pill, put in Pod.
How do you mean?
Asked Homily, startled. A liver pill for Loopy. Pod spoke wearily. Someone started the rumour, he went on, that there were liver pills on the drawing-room mantelpiece.
Oh,
said Homily, and looked thoughtful.
I never heard that. All the same, she exclaimed, it was stupid and foolhardy. There's no way down except by the bell pull. She dusted him, they say, with a feather duster. And he stood so still alongside a Cupid that she might never have noticed him if he hadn't sneezed. She was new, you see, and didn't know the ornaments. We heard her screeching right here under the kitchen. And they could never get her to clean anything much after that wasn't chairs or tables, least of all the tiger skin rug.
And here we have a lovely drawing of the mantelpiece from side to side. And if you look very carefully, unlike that poor maid who is so startled, you can see just here Uncle Hendreary sneezing as the woman dusts around him. That must have been quite a shocking thing to witness. I don't hardly never bother with the drawing room, said Pod. Everything's got its place, like, and they see what goes. There might be a little something left on a table or down the side of a chair, but not without there's been company, and there never is no company, not for the last 10 or 12 years. Sitting here in this chair, I can tell you by heart every blessed thing that's in that drawing room, working round from the cabinet by the window to the...
There's a mint of things in that cabinet, interrupted Homily. Solid silver, some of 'em. A solid silver violin they got there, strings and all. Just right for our Ariete.
What's the good, asked Pod, of things behind glass?
Couldn't you break it? Suggested Ariete. Just a corner. Just a little tap. Just a...
Her voice faltered as she saw the shocked amazement on her father's face.
Listen here, Ariete,
began Homily angrily.
And then she controlled herself and patted Ariette's clasped hands. She don't know much about borrowing, she explained to Pod. You can't blame her. She turned again to Ariette. Borrowing's a skilled job, an art like. Of all the families who've been in this house, there's only us left. And do you know for why? Because your father, Ariette, is the best borrower that's been known in these parts since, well, before your granddad's time. Even your Aunt Loopy admitted that much. When he was younger, I've seen your father walk the length of a laid dinner table after the gong was rung, taking a nut or sweet from every dish and down by a fold in the tablecloth as the first people came in at the door. They'd do it just for fun, wouldn't you, Pod? Pod smiled wanly. There was no sense in it, he said. Maybe, said Homily, but you did it. Who else would dare? I were younger then, said Pod. He sighed and turned to Ariette. You don't break things, lass. That's not the way to do it. That's not borrowing. We were rich then, said Homily. Oh, we did have some lovely things. You were only a tot, Ariette, and wouldn't remember. We had a whole house suite of walnut furniture out of the doll's house, and a set of wine glasses in green glass, and a musical snuff box. And the cousins would come and we'd have parties. Do you remember, Pod? Not only the cousins, the harpsichords came. Everybody came, except those overmantels from the morning room. And we'd dance and dance, and the young people would sit out by the grating. 3 tunes that snuff box played: Clementine, God Save the Queen, and the post-chaise gallop. We were the envy of everybody, even the overmantels. Who were the overmantels? Asked Ariette. Oh, you must have heard me talk about the overmantels, exclaimed Homily. That stuck-up lot who lived in the wall high up, among the lathe and plaster behind the mantelpiece in the morning room. And a queer lot they were. The men smoked all the time, because the tobacco jars were kept there, and they'd climb about in and out of the carvings of the overmantel, sliding down pillars and showing off. The women were a conceited lot too, always admiring themselves in all those bits of overmantel looking glass. They never asked anyone up there, and I, for one, never wanted to go. I've no head for heights, and your father never liked the men. He's always lived steady, your father has. And not only the tobacco jars, but whiskey decanters too, were kept in the morning room. And they say those overmantel men would suck up the dregs in the glasses through those quill pipe cleaners they keep there on the mantelpiece. I don't know whether it's true, but they do say that those overmantel men used to have a party every Tuesday after the bailiff had been to talk business in the morning room. Laid out they'd be, dead drunk, or so the story goes, on the green plush tablecloth, all among the tin boxes and the account books. Now, Ormley, protested Pod, who did not like gossip, I never seed 'em. But we can see them, for there are illustrations here of the overmantels having enjoyed too much drink on the table, and here also slumped over a book with their pipe cleaner still in the glass. But you wouldn't put it past 'em, Pod. You said yourself when I married you not to call on the overmantels.
They lived so high, said Pod. That's all.
Well, they were a lazy lot. That much you can't deny. They never had no kind of home life. Kept themselves warm in winter by the heat of the morning room fire, and ate nothing but breakfast food. Breakfast, of course, was the only meal served in the morning room. What happened to them? Asked Ariete. Well, when the master died and she took to her bed, there was no more use for the morning room, so the overmantels had to go. What else could they do? No food, no fire. It's a bitter cold room in the winter.
And here we can see the women of the Overmantel tribe enjoying their breakfast in the morning room and admiring their own reflections in the spoon.
And the harpsichords? Asked Ariete. Homily looked thoughtful. Well, they were different. I'm not saying they weren't stuck up too, because they were. Your Aunt Loopy, who married your Uncle Henry, was a harpsichord by marriage, and we all know the airs she gave herself.
Now, Homily, began Pod.
Well, she'd no right to. She was only a rainpipe from the stables before she married harpsichord. Didn't she marry Uncle Henry? Asked Ariete. Yes, later. She was a widow with 2 children, and he was a widower with 3. It's no good looking at me like that, Pod. You can't deny she took it out of poor Henry. She thought it was a come-down to marry a clock. Why? Asked Ariete. Because we clocks live under the kitchen. That's why. Because we don't talk fancy grammar and eat anchovy toast. But to live under the kitchen doesn't say we aren't educated. The clocks are just as old a family as the harpsichords. You remember that, Ariete. Don't let anyone tell you different. Your grandfather could count and write down the numbers up to, what was it, Pod?
57, said Pod.
There, said Homily. 57. And your father can count, as you know, Ariete. He can count and write down the numbers and on, as far as it goes. How far does it go, Pod?
Close to 1,000, said Pod.
There. And he knows the alphabet, because he taught you, Ariete, didn't he? And he would have been able to read, wouldn't you, Pod, if he hadn't had to start borrowing so young? Your Uncle Henry and your father had to go out borrowing at 13. Your age, Ariete. Just think of it. But I should like, began Ariete. So he doesn't have your advantages, went on Homily breathlessly. And just because the harpsichords lived in the drawing room, they moved in there in 1837 to a hole in the wainscot just behind where the harpsichord used to stand, if ever there was one, which I doubt. They were really a family called Linen Press, or some such name, and changed it to harpsichord. What did they live on? Asked Ariete. In the drawing room. Afternoon tea, said Homily. Nothing but afternoon tea. No wonder the children grew up peaky. Of course, in the old days it was better. Muffins and crumpets and such. And good rich cake and jams and jellies. And there was one old harpsichord who could remember syllabub of an evening. But they had to do their borrowing in such a rush, poor things. On wet days, when the human beings sat around all afternoon in the drawing room, the tea would be brought in and taken away again without a chance of the harpsichords getting near it, and on fine days it might be taken out into the garden. Loopy has told me that sometimes there were days and days where they lived on crumbs and on water out of the flower vases. So you can't be too hard on them. Their only comfort, poor things, was to show off a bit and talk like ladies and gentlemen. Did you ever hear your Aunt Loopy talk? Yes. No. I can't remember. Oh, you should have heard her say parquet. That's the stuff the drawing room's made of. Parquet. Parquet, she'd say. Oh, it was lovely. Come to think of it, your Aunt Loopy was the most stuck up of them all.
Harriet shivering, said Pod. We didn't get the little maid up to talk about Aunt Loopy.
Nor we did, cried Homily, suddenly contrite. You should have stopped me, Pod. Oh, there, my lamb, tuck this quilt right round you, and I'll get you a nice drop of piping hot soup.
And yet, said Pod, as Homily, fussing at the stove, ladled soup into the teacup, we did, in a way.
Did what?
Asked Homily. Get her up to talk about Aunt Loopy. Aunt Loopy, Uncle Hendry, and... He paused. Eggletina.
Let her drink her soup first, said Homily.
There's no call for her to stop drinking, said Pod. Chapter 6. Your mother and I got you up, said Pod, to tell you about upstairs. Arrietty, holding the great cup in both hands, looked at him over the edge. Pod coughed. You said a while back that the sky was dark brown with cracks in it. Well, it isn't. He looked at her almost accusingly. It's blue.
I know,
said Arrietty. You know? Exclaimed Pod.
Yes, of course I know. I've got the grating.
Can you see the sky through the grating?
Oh, go on, interrupted Homily. Tell her about the gates.
Well, said Pod ponderously, if you go outside this room, what do you see?
A dark passage,
said Arrietty. And what else?
Other rooms?
And if you go farther?
More passages?
And if you go on, walking on and on, in all the passages under the floor, however they twist and turn, what do you find?
Gates,
said Arrietty. Strong gates. Gates you can't open. And what are they there for?
Against the mice?
Said Arrietty. Yes, agreed Pod uncertainly, as though he gave her half a mark. But mice never hurt no one. What else?
Rats?
Suggested Arrietty. We don't have rats, said Pod. What about cats?
Cats?
Echoed Arrietty, surprised. Or to keep you in, suggested Pod.
To keep me in?
Repeated Arrietty, dismayed. Upstairs is a dangerous place, said Pod. And you, Arrietty, You're all we've got. See? It isn't like Hendreary. He still has 2 of his own and 3 of hers. Once, said Pod, Hendreary had 3. 3 of his own. And here we can see the little family arrayed around their stove, having a very difficult conversation about the realities of life.
Your father's thinking of Eglina, said Homily.
Yes, said Pod, Eglina. They never told her about upstairs, and they hadn't got no grating. They told her the sky was nailed up, like, with cracks in it.
A foolish way to bring up a child, murmured Homily. She sniffed slightly and touched Ariette's hair.
But Eglina was no fool, said Pod. She didn't believe them. So one day, he went on, she went upstairs to see for herself.
How did she get out?
Asked Ariette, interested. Well, we didn't have so many gates then, just the one under the clock. And Drury must have left it unlocked or something. Anyway, Eglina went out.
In a blue dress, said Homily, and a pair of button boots your father made her. Yellow kid with jet beads for buttons. Lovely they were.
Well, said Pod, any other time it might have been all right. She'd have gone out, had a look around, had a bit of a fright, maybe, and come back. None the worse and no one the wiser.
But things have been happening, said Homily.
Yes, said Pod. She didn't know, as they never told her, that her father had been seen, and that upstairs they had got in the cat, and
they waited a week, said Homily, and they waited a month, and they hoped for a year. But no one ever saw Eglina no more.
And that, said Pod, after a pause and eyeing Ariette, is what happened to Eglina.
There was silence, except for Pod's breathing and the faint bubble of the soup. It just broke up your Uncle Hendreary, said Homily at last. He never went upstairs again. In case, he said, he found the button boots. Their only future was to emigrate.
Ariette was silent a moment. Then she raised her head.
Why did you tell me? She asked. Now, tonight.
Homily got up. She moved restlessly towards the stove.
We don't never talk of it, she said. At least, not much. But tonight, we felt...
She turned suddenly.
Well, we'll just say it out. Your father's been seen, Ariette. Oh, said Ariette. Who by? Well, by something you never even heard of. But that's not the point. The point is... You think they'll get a cat? They may, said Homily. Ariete set down the soup for a moment. She stared into the cup as it stood beside her almost knee-high on the floor. There was a dreamy, secret something about her lowered face. Couldn't we emigrate? She ventured at last, very softly. Homily gasped and clasped her hands and swung away towards the wall. You don't know what you're talking about, she cried, addressing a frying pan which hung there. Worms and weasels and cold and damp and... But supposing, said Ariete, that I went out, like Eccletina did, and the cat ate me. Then you and Papa would emigrate, wouldn't you? She asked, and her voice faltered. Wouldn't you? Homily swung round again, this time towards Ariete. Her face looked very angry. I shall smack you, Ariete Clock, if you don't behave yourself this minute. Ariete's eyes filled with tears. I was only thinking, she said, that I'd like to be there, to emigrate too. Uneaten, she added softly, and the tears fell. Now, said Pod, this is enough. You get off to bed, Ariete, uneaten and unbeaten, both. And we'll talk about it in the morning. It's not that I'm afraid, cried Ariete angrily. I like cats. I bet the cat didn't eat Eggletina. I bet she just ran away because she hated being cooped up, day after day, week after week, year after year. Like I do, she added on a sob. Cooped up, repeated Homily, astounded. Ariete put her face into her hands. Gates, she gasped. Gates, gates, gates. Pod and Homily stared at each other across Ariete's bowed shoulders. You didn't ought to have brought it up, he said unhappily. Not so late at night. Ariete raised her tear-streaked face. Late or early, what's the difference? She cried. Oh, I know Papa is a wonderful borrower. I know we've managed to stay when all the others have gone, but what's it done for us in the end? I don't think it's so clever to live on alone, for ever and ever in a great big half-empty house, under the floor with no one to talk to, no one to play with, nothing to see but dust and passages. No light but candlelight and firelight and what comes through the cracks. Eggletina had brothers, and Eggletina had half-brothers. Eggletina had a tame mouse. Eggletina had yellow boots with jet buttons, and Eggletina did get out. Just once. Shush, said Pod gently. Not so loud. Above their heads, the floor creaked, and heavy footfalls heaved deliberately to and fro. They heard Mrs. Drybur's grumbling voice and the clatter of the fire irons. Drat this stove, they heard her say. Wind's in the east again. And they heard her raise her voice and call, Crampfurl. Pod sat, staring glumly at the floor. Ariete shivered a little and hugged herself more tightly
into the knitted quilt, and Homily drew a long, slow breath. Suddenly she raised her head. "The child is right," she announced firmly. Ariette's eyes grew big. "Oh, no," she began. It shocked her to be right. Parents were right, not children. Children could say anything, Ariette knew, and enjoy saying it, knowing they were always safe and wrong. "You see, Pod," went on Homily, "it was different for you and me. There was other families, other children. The sinks in the scullery, you remember? And those people who lived behind the knife machine. I forget their names now. And the broom cupboard boys. And there was that underground passage from the stables, you know, that the rain pipes used. We had more, as you might say, freedom."
"Ah, yes," said Pod, "in a way. But where does freedom take you?"
He looked up uncertainly. "Where are they all now?"
"Some of them may have bettered themselves, I shouldn't wonder," said Homily sharply. "Times have changed in the whole house. Pickens aren't what they were. There were those that went. You remember when they dug a trench for the gas pipe? Over the fields and through the wood and all. A kind of tunnel it gave them all the way to Leighton Buzzard."
"And what did they find there?" said Pod, unkindly. "A mountain of coke." Homily turned away.
"Ariette,"
she said, in the same firm voice.
"Supposing one day we'd pick a special day when there was no one about, and providing they don't get a cat, which I have my reasons for thinking they won't, supposing one day your father took you out borrowing. You'd be a good girl, wouldn't you? You'd do just what he said, quickly and quietly, no arguing."
Ariette turned quite pink. She clasped her hands together.
"Oh,"
she began in an ecstatic voice, but Pod cut in quickly. "Now, Homily, we got to think. You can't just say things like that without thinking it out proper. I've been seen, remember. This is no kind of time for taking a child upstairs."
"There won't be no cat," said Homily. "There wasn't no screeching. It's not like that time with Rosa Pickhatchet."
"All the same," said Pod uncertainly, "the risk's there. I never heard of no girl going borrowing before."
"The way I look at it," said Homily, "and it's only now it's come to me, if you had a son, you'd take him borrowing now, wouldn't you? Well, you haven't got no son, only Ariette. Suppose anything happened to you or me, where would Ariette be if she hadn't learned to borrow?"
Pod stared down at his knees. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I see what you mean."
"And it'll give her a bit of interest like, and stop her hankering."
"Hankering for what?"
"For blue sky and grass and such like."
Ariette caught her breath, and Homily turned on her swiftly.
"It's no good, Ariette. I'm not going to emigrate. For you, or for anyone else."
said Pod, and began to laugh. "So, that's it."
"Shush,"
said Homily, annoyed, and glanced quickly at the ceiling.
"Not so loud. Now, kiss your father, Ariette," she went on briskly, "and pop off back to bed." As Ariete snuggled down under the bedclothes, she felt, creeping up from her toes, a glow of happiness, like a glow of warmth. She heard their voices rising and falling in the next room. Homily went on and on, measured and confident. There was, Ariete felt, a kind of conviction behind it. It was the winning voice. Once she heard Pod get up and the scrape of a chair. "I don't like it," she heard him say, and she heard Homily whisper, "Hush." And there were tremulous footfalls on the floor above and the sudden clash of pans. Ariete, half dozing, gazing up at her painted ceiling. Flor de Havana proclaimed the banners proudly. Garantizados, superiores, non plus extra, exquisitos. And the lovely, gauzy ladies blew their trumpets silently, triumphantly, on soundless notes of glee. All right, everyone. That is all for today. I found that very moving. The conviction in each of those characters made me choke up a little bit. It has been such a long time since I read The Borrowers, or it was read to me, that I had forgotten the tone of the book. I think it captures that sort of time period in which it was written in the 50s. In the wake of the Second World War, Britain was going through a very difficult time indeed, and for many people it seemed like their old way of life was coming to an end. And I certainly feel that deep pain at the loss of community, which many people would have experienced. I am so enjoying reading this book with you, and I hope that you are enjoying it too. Thank you so much for joining me for this second part of The Borrowers. From me and from Pepper, who seems very relaxed indeed, I will bid you adieu now. A fond farewell until we meet again. I wish you all the best, and goodbye.